Chapter 12. The Strain of Living as a Dog. Emily lay curled in the corner of her trailer, her body limp from exhaustion. The day had been brutal, scene after scene of running, barking, and chasing, her muscles aching from the constant strain. Her fur was damp with sweat, and her paws throbbed from the endless pounding against the artificial turf of the set. The trailer was quiet now, the hum of the air conditioning the only sound. The crew had packed up for the day, and the set was dark. But Emily hadn't moved from her spot. She could feel the weight of her body pressing down on her, her limbs heavy and unresponsive. The physical toll had been growing for weeks, her body pushing the limits of what she could endure. She hadn't anticipated this. When she had agreed to undergo the transformation, she had known there would be challenges, learning to move in a new body, adjusting to her heightened senses. But she hadn't been prepared for the sheer exhaustion that came with living as a dog. Every day was a marathon, her body pushed to its limits by the demands of the role. And it wasn't just the physical strain, it was the constant battle between her human mind and her canine instincts, a battle that was becoming harder and harder to win. The door to the trailer creaked open, and Paul stepped inside, his eyes immediately finding her curled form. He hesitated for a moment before crossing the small space and kneeling beside her. "Emily," he said softly, his hand resting gently on her back. "You okay?" Emily opened her eyes, blinking slowly as she tried to focus on him. She wanted to answer, to tell him how tired she was, how overwhelmed she felt. But the words wouldn't come. Her throat felt tight, her jaw stiff, and all she could manage was a low, soft whine. Paul's expression softened, his hand moving in slow, soothing strokes along her fur. "You've been pushing yourself too hard," he said quietly. "I can see it. The crew can see it. You need to take a break." She shook her head, or at least, she tried to. The movement felt awkward, unnatural, her body no longer responding the way it should. She could feel the disconnect between her mind and her body growing stronger, the line between her human thoughts and her canine instincts blurring more with each passing day. I can't," she finally managed to say, her voice rough and strained. "I have to keep going." Paul frowned, his hand stilling on her back. "Emily, you're going to burn yourself out. This isn't sustainable." She knew he was right. She could feel it in every aching muscle, in every labored breath. But she couldn't stop. She had made a promise, to herself, to the director, to the team. She had agreed to this transformation, had committed to becoming the character in every way possible. And now, she felt like she was teetering on the edge of something she couldn't quite name. The physical demands were only part of the problem. The real strain, the thing that was slowly breaking her, was the constant flood of sensory information. Her heightened senses had been a marvel at first, something she had reveled in. The way she could smell every scent in the air, hear the softest rustle of leaves, see the world in 1,000 vibrant shades. But now, it was too much. Every sound, every smell, every movement overwhelmed her. The constant barrage of sensory input was relentless, her mind struggling to process it all. The world was too loud, too bright, too alive, and there was no escape from it. She had tried to explain it to Dr. Shaw during one of their check-ins, but even he had struggled to fully understand. He had listened. Of course, his expression thoughtful as she described the way her senses were constantly on high alert, her mind unable to filter out the noise. He had offered her reassurance, told her that her brain would eventually adjust, that she just needed time to acclimate. But time wasn't helping. If anything, it was getting worse. Every day, the world felt sharper, more intense. Her nose picked up scents she couldn't identify. Her ears twitched at sounds too faint for human hearing. And it was all too much. She was drowning in it, her human mind unable to keep up with the onslaught of information. "Emily, please, please," Paul said, his voice breaking through the fog of her thoughts. "You need rest. You're not a machine. You're not invincible." She let out a low, frustrated growl, the sound rumbling deep in her throat. She hated feeling like this, so vulnerable, so out of control. She had always prided herself on her strength, on her ability to push through any challenge. But this was different. This was a battle against her own body, against instincts she couldn't fully understand or control. "I can't stop," she whispered, her voice shaking. "If I stop, I'll lose everything." Paul's hand moved to her head, gently stroking the soft fur behind her ears. "You won't lose anything. Emily, you're still you. You're still the same person, no matter what your body looks like." But was she? She wasn't sure anymore. The more time she spent in this body, the more she felt like she was losing herself. The human thoughts, the memories, the emotions, they were all still there, buried deep beneath the surface. But they were harder to reach now, harder to hold on to. The estrus cycles didn't help. They were becoming more frequent, more intense, each one leaving her feeling raw and exposed. The first time had been a shock, an overwhelming wave of heat and need that had consumed her, leaving her mind scrambling to cope. But now, even though she knew what to expect, it didn't make it any easier. The cycles brought with them a flood of hormones, a primal urge that her body couldn't ignore. She had learned to control it, to suppress the worst of the instincts that came with it. But it was always there, lurking in the back of her mind, a constant reminder that her body was no longer human. She hated it, hated the way it made her feel, like she was losing control, like she was being pulled in two different directions. Her human mind knew what was happening, but her body didn't care. It responded to the hormones, to the instincts, in ways she couldn't fully control. And every time she went through it, she felt a little more of her humanity slipping away. Paul stayed with her for a while, his hand a constant, soothing presence on her back. He didn't push her to talk, didn't try to force her to rest. He just sat there, quietly offering his support, and for that, she was grateful. Eventually, he stood up, his hand lingering on her fur for a moment longer. "I'll be back in the morning," he said softly. "Try to get some sleep." Emily didn't respond. She didn't have the energy to. She watched as he left the trailer, the door clicking shut behind him, and then let out a long, slow breath. The night dragged on, and sleep didn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, her body tense with the lingering effects of the day's work. She could still feel the strain in her muscles, the dull ache in her paws, and the constant hum of sensory information buzzing in her brain. "I can't keep doing this." The thought came unbidden, a sharp, painful truth that she had been trying to ignore for weeks. But now, in the quiet of the trailer, with no one watching, no one expecting anything from her, she couldn't push it away any longer. She was reaching her limit. The next morning, Emily dragged herself onto the set, her body moving on autopilot. The crew greeted her with polite smiles, their eyes filled with the same awe and fascination that had followed her since the transformation. They didn't see the exhaustion in her eyes, didn't notice the way her legs trembled slightly with each step. To them, She was still the incredible, groundbreaking actress who had become a dog, the perfect embodiment of the character. But they didn't know the truth. They they didn't know how much of her humanity she had lost in the process. "Emily, are you ready for the next scene?" The director called, his voice brisk and efficient as always. She nodded, an automatic response, one she had perfected over the weeks of filming. She didn't trust herself to speak, didn't trust that her voice would come out sounding anything other than broken. The scene was another simple one. Emily, as the dog, would interact with the main character, a little girl who had formed a bond with her. It was meant to be an emotional moment, a quiet exchange of trust and love between human and animal. But as the cameras began to roll, Emily struggled to stay present. Her body felt heavy, her mind foggy, and the constant flood of sensory information made it hard to focus. She could hear the hum of the equipment, the low murmur of voices from the crew, the distant sound of birds chirping outside the soundstage. It was all too much, too loud, too intense. She blinked, trying to clear her head, but the scene was slipping away from her. She could see the little girl in front of her, her wide eyes filled with emotion, but Emily couldn't connect. She couldn't feel the moment the way she was supposed to. "Cut!" The director's voice rang out, sharp and sudden. Emily flinched, her ears flattening against her head. She had messed up. She could feel it. The director approached her, his expression a mix of concern and frustration. "Emily, what's going on? You're not yourself today." She wanted to explain, wanted to tell him how tired she was, how overwhelmed she felt. But the words wouldn't come. Her throat was tight, her mind a jumble of conflicting thoughts. All she could do was stare at him, her amber eyes wide and confused. The director sighed, rubbing a hand across his face. "Take 5? Okay, we'll try again in a bit." Emily nodded weakly, her body sagging with relief as she slunk off the set. She found a quiet corner behind one of the large props and collapsed onto the ground, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She couldn't keep doing this. The physical strain, the sensory overload, the constant battle between her human mind and her canine body, it was all too much. She was losing herself, and no amount of determination or willpower could stop it. I don't know who I am anymore," the thought echoed in her mind, a painful truth she had been trying to ignore. She had chosen this path, had willingly undergone the transformation. But now, as her body continued to push her to the brink, she wasn't sure if she had made the right choice. She wasn't sure if she could hold on to who she had been. The next few days were a blur of exhaustion and frustration. Emily pushed through each scene, her body moving on autopilot, her mind barely hanging on. The crew noticed her fatigue, but no one said anything. They were all too in awe of her transformation, too caught up in the spectacle of what she had become. But Emily felt the strain every second of every day. The physical demands, the sensory overload, the constant pull of her instincts, it was all wearing her down, piece by piece. And through it all, the estrus cycles loomed in the background, a constant, unwelcome reminder that her body was no longer her own. Each cycle brought with it a flood of hormones, a primal need that her human mind struggled to suppress. She hated the way it made her feel, like she was losing control, like she was slipping further and further away from the person she had once been. By the end of the week, Emily was barely holding on. Her body was exhausted, her mind frayed, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep going. The line between her human thoughts and her canine instincts was blurring more with each passing day, and the weight of it all was crushing her. She had chosen this path. She had agreed to the transformation. But now But now, as the strain of living as a dog continued to take its toll, she wasn't sure if she could survive it. That night, as she lay in her trailer, staring up at the ceiling, Emily made a decision. She had to talk to Dr. Shaw. She had to tell him the truth about how she was feeling, about how much she was struggling. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay. The next morning, Emily found herself sitting in Dr. Shaw's office, her body tense with anxiety. He sat across from her, his expression calm and professional as always. "Emily," he said softly, his voice gentle. "How are you feeling?" She hesitated, her mind racing. How could she put into words the exhaustion, the confusion, the overwhelming sense of losing herself? I'm tired, she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so tired." Dr. Shaw nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I've noticed that you've been struggling. The physical demands of your new body, the heightened senses, it's a lot to adjust to." "It's more than that," Emily said, her voice trembling. "It's like I'm losing myself. I don't know who I am anymore." Dr. Shaw's gaze softened. "Emily, you're still you. Your mind, your memories, your thoughts, they're all still there. But they're getting harder to reach," she said, her voice cracking. "Every day, it feels like I'm slipping further away. The instincts, they're taking over." Dr. Shaw was silent for a moment, his eyes studying her closely. The transformation was always going to be difficult. "Emily, you're living in a body that wasn't originally yours. But your mind, your human consciousness, is still in control." "Is it?" she asked desperately, "because it doesn't feel like it. It feels like I'm being pulled in two different directions, and I don't know how much longer I can hold on." Dr. Shaw's expression was serious now, his voice low and measured. "Emily, you need to rest. Your body and mind are under an incredible amount of stress, and you're pushing yourself too hard." "I can't rest," she said, shaking her head. "I have to keep going. I have to finish filming." Dr. Shaw leaned forward, his gaze intense. "You can't finish filming if you burn yourself out. You need to take care of yourself, Emily. If you don't, you're going to lose more than just the role." Emily felt a lump form in her throat, her chest tightening with fear. She had been so focused on the role, on giving the performance of a lifetime, that she hadn't stopped to consider what it was doing to her. She hadn't stopped to consider what she was losing in the process. As she left Dr. Shaw's office that day, Emily knew that something had to change. She couldn't keep pushing herself like this, couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay. The strain of living as a dog was taking its toll, and if she didn't find a way to cope, she was going to lose herself completely. But the question remained, how could she hold on to her humanity when her body was no longer her own?